Boom, doom, gloom, criminals pillage, cities burn, mobs rampage, tyrants rule with iron fists because we live in a society. And people here often feel that we are overdue for dystopia. Even now, dystopian fiction tales prove popular among many readers. Let's explore why this is and ask whether Christian fans really need these kinds of stories.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Welcome back to the optimistic podcast, Fantastical Truth from Lorehaven.com, in which we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I am Steve Burnett. I publish Lorehaven.com. I am out of the bunker on this beautiful fall day, even though I was never in the bunker. I also authored a science fiction adventure novel launching in March from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth.
I'm Zackary Russell, and I am coming to you from District 12 in the world state near Oceania, and this is episode 238. Do Christians need dystopian fiction?
If you're feeling a sense of doom out there, come on into our studio. Pull up a chair. We have a fake fire in the fireplace, and it's fake because this is Texas, and we only cosplay fall here at this time of year. But we'll give you some not quite hot chocolate and prepare you for Thanksgiving and the Christmas season by celebrating this genre that a lot of readers still love very much. A lot of readers think that this is in the past, but I have personally seen dystopian stories, particularly those by Christian authors, still prove very popular among many fans.
Yeah, and as we're going to look at today, this is a genre with very deep historical roots. This is not the literary analysis podcast, but this genre has been popular for much longer than just the recent, spate of Hunger Games and other types of teenage dystopias. There's a lot of dystopian fiction throughout human history, and I think more than anything, it really taps into something that we all fear, which is government. Just the word makes people tremble.
Dun, dun, dun.
So, and obviously we're talking about bad government, but, to the libertarians out there, they're thinking any kind of government is dystopian.
Yeah, I don't know if I subscribe to that take, because if you read the Bible, Romans 13 speaks very positively about government in its role to reward good and punish evil. He, the civil magistrate, the Apostle Paul writes, does not bear the sword in vain. So the Bible does have a healthy view of government. That is an ideal. As to whether the government you see around you reflects that ideal, that is a different issue. We'll get into the concession stand in just a moment. First, however, at Lorehaven, we have explored dystopian stories off and on ever since we started about 6-7 years ago. I'd have to tally the anniversary there. We've had a previous podcast episode, for example, about compare-contrast between Brave New World and 1984. And we've discussed other dystopian stories, the classic ones for the grown-ups, as well as the more fun ones about the robust teen rebels who need to overthrow the world government and also find that love connection with the triangle on the side. We'll have those links in the show notes should you wish to go deeper. We also do reviews of the best new Christian-made fantastical novels we've found every Friday. Our most recent review was of book 2 of the series by Victoria McCombs, Lethal Kings, sequel to Mortal Queens. You can find that review in there. I believe, if I did my math right, again, it releases today, the episode release date for this episode. Either way, new reviews every week at Lorehaven. Subscribe free, and you can get notified whenever we post a new one, as well as the articles and podcast episodes and such that we provide. Lorehaven.com/subscribe is your link. We're also doing our new book quest in the Lorehaven Guild, our Castle in the Cloud at Discord. of the novel The Burning Tree by Helen Dent. So if you're feeling like your community is kind of being torn apart by a curse with mythological origins and you just like to do something about that, well, you might find, of course, that the sin starts in your heart as well as the heart of the forest. And that book, West, although we're a week into it as of today, maybe if you're a fast reader, it's not too late to join in, but you can only get that code for the Lorehaven Guild by going to lorehaven.com and subscribing free. Hey, speaking of Lethal Kings, that is the subject of our top sponsor, Enclave Publishing. That book by Victoria McCombs just released, and it is book 2 in the 2-book Fae Dynasty Saga. You've been warned many times you cannot trust the kings. Well, what a great line, Zach. Wow, that matches really well with this theme. The old queen is dead, a new queen is in play, and the realm has descended into darkness. For the first time in history, a queen has rejected the game. Eliza will start her reign with no alliances, while Althea must fight to save her tenuous bond with a king who cannot love. Her relationship threatens to break, but Althea's attention becomes divided after receiving a few harrowing clues connecting her past and the game at hand. Before she can find answers, a mysterious fae appears, promising the power of the seventh king to whoever can solve a series of riddles, leaving the fae realm in shambles as they race to come out on top. Althea has 1 year left. New alliances are forged, old stories come to life. She must make her move, or the fate of the queens will consume her. Enclave Publishing presents Lethal Kings Book 2 in the 2-book Fae Dynasty Saga by Victoria McCombs, available now wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for it at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon or at enclavepublishingstore.com, where I happen to know there is a 20% off discount permanent across all of those hardcover editions, including mine. It's also available in audio from Oasis Audio. You can see that great cover and all the show notes for this episode 238. Or for the entire archive, go to lorehaven.com/podcast.
All right, well, let's dive into our concession stand, because in the dystopian world, you're often starving, maybe a little hungry for some food that you have to compete against other teenagers to get. So the first thing I want to say is this is part of our ongoing disconnected miniseries called Fiction's Chief End, where we explore all kinds of genres and ask, do Christians need these? Like, is this necessary? Like, why are we having these books? And so, yes, we use the word need to say that this is an important thing to read and talk about. As I mentioned earlier, the dystopian genre has biblical roots. It's seen in the real life encounters between David and King Saul. So we talked in our episode about horror, how Goliath, in a sense, is sort of a horror monster, right? Like 8 or 9 feet tall, armored with these bronze scales that weighed probably more than David weighed, with weapons that just could kill you every which way. Seems to be no way to defeat him. And yet we all know David did. And so that was kind of like a primordial horror story, even though it's a human character. I mean, it's sort of like Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees are human, right? But they're still monsters anyway. But when David is being pursued by Saul and he's on the run and he's fearing for his life, and Saul is using the entire force of government to try to stamp him out. I mean, that is a dystopian story. Also, in the parable that Jesus tells about the persistent widow, there is the wicked judge that finally gives in to this widow's request, not because he's righteous, but because he's tired of her. And how often does that, mirror what we have all experienced at the DMV, let's say, or other facets of government that no one likes? What we're talking about here with dystopian is man versus society. So man versus man, plural. In this case, we're talking about individuals who have to fight against a whole system, a whole collection of people. When you look at our own country, the United States, at least that's where Stephen and I are, dystopian stories are kind of foundational, I would say, because we were born out of a dystopia, out of a very tyrannical monarchy that took everything it wanted from us and stamped out any kind of protest, put soldiers in your home, took all your money, however it wanted, and gave you no recourse to address these wrongs. And this is what the Declaration of Independence addressed, and then the Revolutionary War, and then the Constitution were all a response to this dystopia that the early American colonists were facing. And yes, we are recording this episode right after a national election in the US. Now, the timing is not a bug, it is a feature. So this is not an accident. We've been planning this for a while. This is a very purposeful episode. It's because in this time that we're in between administrations and everyone is, trying to put things into place for the next 4 years, everyone is trying to present their vision of the future, whether it's a positive vision, like this is what we're going to do, or it's a very negative vision of like, these are all the horrible things that are going to happen. Look at all these dark things that have happened in stories, just like what we're seeing. People are focusing their attention and their imaginations on stories that they've read or that maybe they heard, or maybe they should have read and they didn't. They just read the Cliff Notes version. I am very much confessing that of myself because I did not read 1984 in high school like I was supposed to have. I've read it as an adult, but it's the stories that we're going to focus on today in this podcast. Why these dystopian stories resonate, why they get brought up so much in election season and so forth, what purpose do these stories serve? And also there is a hidden challenge. And then we'll talk about that in chapter 3. But if you're new to the podcast, just so you know, we try to do our best on this podcast to avoid conversations about politicians and so forth. If you've been around a while, you know that we do our best because this is not the Political Truth podcast. It's the Fantastical Truth podcast. We're also going to avoid the cliche sort of discussions that people have about dystopian books, like, oh, it's always about teenage rebel love triangles. Like, we're not going to get into all that. We're going to talk about, again, what are the really positive and helpful and even those challenging aspects of dystopian.
Yeah, Zach, my favorite dystopia, although I've enjoyed some of the classic novels and such, and I did read The Hunger Games once when it was at its peak, so I caught up to it later as a normie. But my favorite dystopia, similar to romance, is not as a genre all unto itself, but as a seasoning for other genres. Technically, my first novel, Above the Circle of Earth, could be construed as post-dystopian. There's some stuff that goes on in the history of the story, and yet it's a little bit of a different take on that. This isn't simply, Christians being absolutely persecuted by government. It's a little bit more nuanced. And so I think some stories can do better when they're a little bit more nuanced with that dystopian take. An example, I think, though, of a non-nuanced story whose tropes are pretty popular right now anyway, is The Handmaid's Tale. So you forgot to mention Gilead there at the top of the show.
That's right.
But of course, you and I being men, apparently we make out very well in that future impossible dystopia of Gilead. Maybe a different ending that I would have plotted for the story, although I've not read it. I'd like to imagine that there's only one way to get rid of the dystopian government in that world. That is to plant a bomb in Gilead. But if you're familiar with there is a bomb in Gilead. Anyway, jokes aside, dystopia is not just part of the founding myth of the United States, but also the legends that happen to be true of our world. It starts not just with the madness of King George, but the madness of King Adam in the Garden of Eden, deciding to become like a god, to throw away biblical responsibility for his role as the sovereign over creation appointed by God, and then to bring a curse upon creation. And ever since then, any other human government has been vulnerable to the curse of excesses of power. It's not the power that's a problem. It's the illusion of absolute power that corrupts absolutely, as Lord Acton famously said. Humans are not meant to have that power. God is. When we try to be like God, everything goes sideways into dystopia. So I'm guessing then later that you could say, okay, maybe the British government in the American founding legend is not as bad as some dystopian government, but it was on the way. It was certainly on the spectrum. And so I think that every government is always going to be on that spectrum, leading to abuse of power or some sort of tyranny, or maybe even in some cases, some sort of anarchy. And the worst case scenarios we see around us is a government that somehow manages to really, really mess up and give its subjects both at the same time. And that's why we have dystopian fiction, to show different versions of dystopian. So if you only like one of them, as they say about some of these fans of The Handmaid's Tale, you might want to read another book. We've got a few different dystopian futures that we need to prevent. a diversity of dystopian fiction can help us avoid them, which is the topic of Chapter 1. Dystopian fiction helps us face real life dystopia.
Yeah. So here is why this genre resonates with most people. So most people are not in positions of leadership in the government, in the political system. We can't touch the levers of power necessarily. Now, yes, we all vote and we all understand the importance of democracy and using our vote and campaigning and fundraising and whatnot. Getting your I voted sticker. Well, I mean, I did read that 8% fewer Christians or evangelicals voted in the 2024 election than in the previous one. So I don't know. Maybe this idea has kind of gone away. But although there does seem to be record turnout in a lot of places, so I don't know what to tell you there. But the reality is that most of us do not make decisions that affect millions of people. Okay, so. And while we would love for people who are in those positions to read more dystopian books, maybe that would put a few things in check. This genre is not really for political leaders. At least this is my thesis right here. First of all, for an author to only write a book for a very, very narrow group of people, it's probably not going to become a bestseller. So most of these books are aimed at the average citizen who has very little political capital. And that's kind of what makes it scary. Like I said, it's sort of like a horror story, but instead of the horror monster being the giant or the alien, it's the whole country or the whole government. It's the whole system that's coming after you. And so it gives us a blueprint for how to be resilient in the face of that. Dystopian can be hard for some people, Stephen, I've noticed, because it can be kind of depressing, honestly. Books like 1984, I had to keep putting it down. I'm like, man, this is pretty bleak, what's going on in the story.
I had to be really careful going through 1984 and Brave New World. It was a slog at times.
It feels like nothing will ever get better. It's only going from bad to worse. So I totally understand why this may not be everyone's cup of tea, or like you said, they like it as a flavoring and not as a pure experience. It's like having coffee black versus having a ton of creamer with a dash of coffee in it. It just depends on what your tastes are. But for you, our listener, maybe you are worried about the next 4 years of our country, and that could even be the case if your candidate won. That is a really interesting thing I am looking at on social media right now, Stephen, is there are people who are not unhappy with the election results, but they are really worried about who gets to be in those positions of power, who gets those levers of power. Is it going to be a bozo? Is it going to be a tyrant? Is it going to be just the same old, and nothing's really going to change? Like, everyone is kind of worried about it, even if they're glad with how the re-election turned out. And obviously, people that are not happy how it turned out, they're very worried about everyone that's going to be in power. So that's kind of what I'm saying, is that dystopian stories have a very broad appeal because I think we're always afraid of the boot that's always stamping on our neck. I don't know how far back this goes, but for almost as long as I've been alive, or at least aware of politics. So, I mean, I'm 45, but about 25-ish years now I've been paying attention. Every election is billed as the most important election of our lifetime. And I keep wondering why that is. The simple explanation is that that's the media hype. That's how the political action committees try to mobilize fundraising. That's how canvassers try to get you registered so you'll vote. It's sort of just the fear tactic of you got to get involved and you got to watch the news so that they can, get paid by advertisers because you're watching all day. But I also think that there is some amount of truth to this, that it's always the most important election. It's because every election cycle, our government is getting bigger and more powerful and more invasive in some ways, especially with the rise of digital technology, and so much can be learned about you. And then you look a little further ahead to countries like China, where they have a social credit score, and the government knows if you jaywalk, and they know your bank account, and they will immediately fine you and lower your social credit score to make it hard for you to do things. Like, it's all automated. So we look at things like that happening in the real world, and we're like, are we headed towards that? Like, is that why it's so important this year to elect the right person? But there's that fear is what I'm trying to say. That fear is always present. I mean, do you feel that fear sometimes, Stephen, in the elections of just like, what's going to happen?
I do not personally feel that fear as much as I thought I would. And I'm checking my privilege, as it were, because this year I have been extremely busy with the novel project, as well as my usual Lorehaven duties, as well as the day job, as well as a lot of other things. So to some extent, although I have definitely kept up, because it's a hobby for me to keep up with the political scene and the cultural scene, and it has been, by the way, since I was a teenager. I mean, I was keeping up with the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Vice President Al Gore, as if I had voted in that election, even though I couldn't yet vote in that election. Okay, folks, I'm not that old. But it was great fun back then, and it was very dramatic back then. For those who remember, all eyes were on Florida, for example. And not to get too much into that, it just shows that I am interested in this. But this year, I really did not feel the fear as much, because there's some various cultural trends that I don't mind naming. Like, for example, the one thing that I do fear the most is, I would say, the sexual revolution, the secularist sexual revolution, which quickly becomes sexual imperialism. And that touches what we do at Lorehaven, because sexual imperialism is not just the levying of cultural expectations and even legislation with punishment from the top if you don't subscribe to this revisionist view of human sexual identity, but this stuff also affects and infects the kinds of stories that we are enjoying. Young adult novels, for example, like Jessica wrote recently at Lorehaven, we'll put that article in the show notes, have increasingly become corrupted by this sexual messaging. Even characters who are minors being shown in these sexual entanglements, whether they're opposite sex or same sex or experimental or trans or any of this stuff. And that is the one thing, I don't care if people call it political, that is the one hill on which I'm willing to live. I'm not going to die on this hill. I'm going to live on this hill, because that affects the heart and soul of the person more than your views on tax policy or economics or the border. This affects how you perceive yourself. And that is the worst kind of dystopian threat that I can imagine. We've talked about it in previous episodes, but that sexual corruption that calls into question who you are, how you see yourself in society, and as a being created by God with purpose. That's the thing that scares me the most. But even this year, Zach, there's been so much pushback on that from so many people across so many different political views that I have felt optimistic. It is like God's common grace, his restraining hand in the world, the Holy Spirit is still holding things together and allowing some kind of order, even through corrupted government. The Holy Spirit seems to have said, "This far shall you come, sexual revolution, but no further at this time." Now, this may change in 20 years. Maybe they get their game together and maybe something goes bad. Maybe there's some technology that enables, artificial wombs. For all we know, it could get really, really gross. But even then, it's like this year I was too busy or just found some overall rest. Like, it seemed to me, God is in control. He is running the plot line this year. I will, as one pundit said, often question his writing choices, but altogether he has a grand finale in store for the human race. And at that point, the story will have just begun, and he'll be reigning on the throne, and we won't have to worry about dystopians no more.
Yeah. For me, the type of dystopia I'm always afraid of is sort of the digital prison.
Yeah.
The extreme version of that in the Matrix, where they're inside a virtual reality prison. Spoilers if you haven't seen that 25-year-old movie, or even just the more recent movies that show sort of a hyper control of society through some tech company like The Circle with Tom Hanks is kind of like that. Eagle Eye with, I forget who that is, where there's sort of a sentient AI that kind of gets into all of our systems and manipulates things. And we see that in TV shows like Person of Interest. I've always been fascinated by information technology. That was my major in college. And I definitely fear how that can ruin society when it's in the wrong hands, which is pretty much anyone's hands if it's powerful enough. And I've written about that for Lorehaven before. But here's what I want to say. We all need to be aware of the fabricated dystopia that our partisan media is trying to convince you that we live in. This is something I'm seeing a lot of discussion about right now on social media without getting into details. A lot of people think they're already living in a dystopian world. Like you mentioned, The Handmaid's Tale. Okay, that's the most obvious one. You see people protesting wearing those outfits, like we're already living in it. It's like, well, if you're already living in that dystopia, you would have to wear those all the time, which you're not. Whereas I look at countries like Iran, where women have to wear outfits like that. If they don't, they are stoned. In fact, there was a very recent case of this where a woman took off, well, not only the head covering, but honestly, almost everything, and she was killed. Looking at geopolitics, looking at the larger picture of the world, that's a good kind of corrective of like, okay, we're not actually living in that sort of dystopia. But really, dystopian books are really good at showing us, hey, you're not actually living in a tyrannical world that's where there's a total state. These books are a helpful corrective to show us the real world that we live in. Now, again, some people use that as in their imagination gets away from them. But these books also show us how people survive, how they respond, and in some cases even conquer these tyrannical, governments. Now, maybe you think the tyrant is the current White House or the incoming White House. Maybe you think it's the deep state behind the White House. Maybe it's some global, lizard people organization like the World Economic Forum. Or maybe it's just your HOA. That's the real tyranny you are facing. Like I just saw a tweet before we recorded this where a woman posted this letter she got from her HOA that said, "Excuse me, according to our rules, you are not allowed to put up Christmas lights until December 1st, and you will be fined every day between now and then." And she's like, "I will go to war with you."
It's the war on Christmas again. So clearly that remains to be fought. Zach, I think the digital prison and this imaginary dystopia in our heads is a big factor here. And that may be why some readers still connect so much with this genre. They're reading about someone rebelling against the government, and then they're thinking about what's going on with their parents or what's going on with the imaginary foes they make out in the media, and they're saying, "Yeah, that's my life." I'm going to interact real quick with the words of one pundit who's actually a fantastical storyteller, and some of these creators keep blurring the lines between the two roles. He's talking specifically about one doomsday scenario after the election, and he says, quote, "If you believe this, you are akin to the person in the theater experiencing actual terror from the horror movie. The danger is not real. It is all projection and sound. Just look away from the screen. When the lights come up, you aren't in a cabin in the woods with a monster at all. You're in a comfy seat in an air-conditioned box in a suburb somewhere. All is well," end quote. Now, I think he's mostly right there. That's Jeremy Boring, by the way, Daily Wire. But I think at the end there, he might be missing something, because for a lot of these people, all is not well. They are living in a kind of dystopia, but I think they misidentify who the tyrant is. The tyrant may be a disfavored politician or relative or employer or boyfriend, girlfriend, whomever. But the real tyrant there is it is sin and the suffering that is associated with sin. Trauma is real. It's sometimes a result of your own choices and sometimes a result of other people's choices, and most often a result of both. And so I think it's another reason why people love these stories, but maybe they skip too quickly to fight the government or fight the system, when instead the first corrupt system they need to fight is the one that's going on in their own soul.
That is absolutely right, because the real enemy is humanity. It is human nature that is polluted by sin. And it doesn't matter if we get better people in government when, until Jesus returns, we're always going to have governments ruled by sinful and flawed and often evil humans. We aren't going to get the governments we want. Or if we do, it's not going to last very long. I mean, goodness, just look at the history of Israel in the Old Testament. Like, my goodness, it doesn't go well for very long ever, even though God's presence was literally like right there with them the whole time. And so now we're in the church age, and without getting into eschatology, it very much looks like government will even get worse. And that's another reason why we need dystopian books. We need to see how we can live through these periods, because we might be living through those, who knows? But if anything, it's sort of like exposure therapy. People that are afraid of spiders, for example, will go to a counselor for like extreme arachnophobia. And one of the things they might have to do is get a pet spider or get a rubber spider or something, or go to a spider, I don't know, zoo. I don't know if they have those, but basically face that fear in a safe way. It's not going to hurt you, and to help you to see that it's that fear that's your real enemy. It's that fear that's holding you captive and making you trust in things that you shouldn't trust in. And that's actually my concern when it comes to politics. It's not that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. That itself is a fear statement that can get us to trust in some really dark things. I saw a Reddit post of someone that was literally trusting in manifesting and witchcraft and all this kind of stuff to get her candidate of choice. And I'm like, well, there you go. I mean, this is a path that leads to a lot of idolatry. And so dystopian fiction can show us you actually don't have it that bad. Or, as we'll talk about in a second, maybe it is going that way. And so maybe you ought to think about what you can do.
Zach, which science fiction writer was it who said, that you've quoted this person before, I write not to predict the future, but to prevent it? Was that Ray Bradbury?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, way to go,
451.
Ray Bradbury. Yeah, another famous classic dystopian book that I need to read. Zach, great points about coping with fear, almost a little exposure therapy by means of dystopian stories. It's a very similar effect to the horror genre. A lot of people love these stories, not just because they like the feeling of being scared in a safe way, but because they want to face their fears. They want to warm up to them and see if there's any way around them. Because if the hero can escape the monster in the story, maybe then I can escape the monsters that I see in my life. Speaking of dragons to slay, this episode is sponsored by a new sponsor now, our friend Lori Christine, who has a new book out also today, Garden of Mysteries, a Dragon Slayer Bible story. This is new middle grade biblical fiction with a fantastical twist by Lori Christine. An ancient curse, an invisible dragon, a mysterious prophecy. Seth's parents have secrets they won't share with him. Why did the king kick them out of the garden and curse the land? And can the curse be broken? Finding answers to Seth's questions will prove more dangerous than he imagined, and he discovers the truth before the dragon destroys him. Frank Peretti meets the Jesus Storybook Bible in this adventure-packed middle-grade novel that will inspire readers to identify lies of the dragon and to put their trust in Jesus, the Dragon Slayer. Garden of Mysteries, a Dragon Slayer Bible story, is available for purchase now on Amazon. Also, be sure to check out the companion devotional for Garden of Mysteries, sold separately on Amazon. Learn more at dragonslayerbible.com. That is dragonslayerbible.com. You can also see that fantastical cover in our show notes for this episode 238 at lorehaven.com/podcast. Zach, once you start talking about dragons and corruption and sin and bad government and all of this, you just see it everywhere. And so maybe it's no coincidence then that every sponsor for this episode so far seems to be lining up with that. I think every story has a hint of that fear of a government or a leader, a good heroic character gone bad. I think every story needs to touch on that in some way because it's so intrinsic to the human experience, because only then can we have hope to reverse it. That's the topic of chapter 2. Dystopian stories give us a reverse how-to manual.
So I'm kind of playing off here something I heard Max McLean say at the live play adaptation of the Screwtape Letters. He said people often talk about this book as a reverse devotional. It's like, here are all the things you shouldn't do because here is all the things that the demons are trying to tempt you to do. And it's often very minor things. It's little thoughts, it's little decisions. I saw a good comment yesterday that we often have either a really clinical or a way too fantastical view of spiritual warfare. Either we think it's all just academic theory and we just have to make sure we got all our footnotes and our ducks in a row, or we think it's this, fantastical battle and we're slaying demons with the spiritual swords of whatever, or Awanas verses. And often what spiritual warfare is, it's these little nudges that the enemy is making on our lives and also on our society. And so dystopian stories kind of show us, play this out over a long enough period of time, what's going to happen. I got a quote here from one of my favorite people on Twitter, President Dr. Rollergator MVIP PhD. The other day, there was something happening in politics, and this person said, "We are living in the dumbest time in American history." And Dr. Rollergator said, "And just wait, you see how much dumber it can get."
Yeah, that's pessimistic optimism.
Yeah. And so this is what Dystopian shows us. It shows us how dumb things can get, how crazy and how horrible things could get if we keep following this path that we're on. So Dystopian shows us what to avoid. It shows us what can happen when there is unchecked corruption, when there is unchecked immorality. We talk about the social issues every election, right? Well, those matter because those start affecting everything else. And then we look at, abuses of power, and small and large, and how those can play out in these stories. So Dystopian helps us spot those very first steps on the road to hell, which is usually paved with good intentions, as they say, because the problem is that those small compromises can have compounding interest, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, I got a quote from Jack Bauer from the TV show 24. This is from about 20 years ago. And Jack is talking to this character. This is the first season, I think, of 24, which is very interesting if you've seen the entire series. And Jack says, quote, "You can look the other way once and it's no big deal, except it makes it easier for you to compromise the next time. And pretty soon that's all you're doing, compromising, because that's the way you think things are done. You know those guys I busted, you think they were the bad guys? Because they weren't. They weren't bad guys. They were just like you and me, except they compromised once." Man, that is a scary quote, right?
So
and
yep.
It's how evil takes over. It's just one step at a time. It's that they compromised once. Dystopian can show us a world where that just keeps going, and pretty soon people are in too deep. And so it helps us correct that. It helps us try to prevent that. And it shows us what we should be fighting for. It reminds us not to take our current freedoms for granted. As we talked earlier about the Declaration of Independence, like what were all the things that they said were going wrong? And then what did they put in the Constitution of, hey, we recognize that people have rights, and not that government gives you those rights, that God gives you those rights, and the government's job is to protect those. That is a helpful corrective to look at our history. But also as we look into these imagined futures, alternate societies, we see what life would be like if you didn't have freedom of speech, for example. If, there's kind of a funny version of this in Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone and Sandra Bullock. So Sylvester Stallone is like, he lives in our modern day, and then he's frozen in carbonite and woken up much later, along with Wesley Snipes, who's a bad guy. Sylvester Stallone is a cop. And they wake up in this dystopian future, and every time Sylvester Stallone utters a swear word, there's a little machine nearby that prints out a ticket, like a fine, for him to pay money.
They turn him into the Handmaid's Tale. Wow. Now there's a crossover. Yeah. I would not have expected Sylvester Stallone in the Handmaid's Tale beating up the patriarchy.
Yeah. So you look at a future like that where you don't have freedom of speech, and this is how they do it, by the way. They don't actually sew your mouth shut or something crazy like that. They just say, "Oh, well, you can say whatever you want. You'll just have to pay a little money each time you say it." Now, again, they did it in a funny way where it's curse words that get him in trouble. But there are many stories where this happens, where in 1984, as we mentioned, Winston is worried just writing words in a journal that he keeps privately in a desk. First of all, he's worried that Big Brother can see him writing this. So he has to find the dead spot in his room where he doesn't think there's cameras. And then he has to, hide this journal somewhere where hopefully the neighbors' zealous kids aren't going to find it. And he has to keep these thoughts hidden. If he hears other people expressing these thoughts, he has to keep his own thoughts to himself. And boy, you look at that, and then you look at the memory hole that he has to help operate, where they edit newspaper headlines, they edit government reports, and quickly delete those. And boy, we've seen that happen in recent years, haven't we? Where we see Wikipedia or Merriam-Webster dictionary or other news sites, just try to, do stealth edits on things to hope you don't notice. I think one of my favorite ones was there was without going into details, there was a particular political movement, philosophy that was being discussed a lot. And then lo and behold, Wikipedia changed the page. Some editor went and changed the page of that political strategy so that if you tried to quote it, people would say, well, that's not what it is. Go look at what Wikipedia says. And then thankfully people save screenshots to say, no, they just changed it. And that's just one of our 10 or whatever Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, but it's pretty foundational and it almost never exists in a dystopian world.
What's wonderful, Zach, here is I can bring in some good news. And we talked some about this in our episode comparing 1984 and Brave New World back in November 2022. So you can look that up. It's episode 137, listener, if you want to hear that one. Many politicians, whether they are making a right or wrong application, have actually employed language from 1984. Maybe they've never read it, but some of those images, like the memory hole or Big Brother especially, or news speak or thought control or the thought police, like all of those phrases and the concepts loaded into them were invented by George Orwell. And so I think we can say, although we don't have access to God's teacher's manual or his writing outline, but I think we can rightly say that in God's providence, dystopian stories have been used already to prevent some of these things. Or if other people are trying some of these things, because even though they know it's wrong to memory hole things, well, we got to do something about the fake news, don't we? And the misinformation. So, maybe we can use the memory hole and compromise just this once. And then other people come along and say, wait a minute, that's like the memory hole from 1984. And the meme has now been spread. Oh, you don't want to be like Inksock. You don't want to be like Big Brother. And memory hole stuff. Truth is truth, and you got to admit that, hey, we have not actually always been at war with this other country. It's a matter of simple history. And so imagination then is being used in God's providence, and often by name by politicians to say, don't do this, because they grew up with these stories before these people got in government. They at least had some ideals that they were taught. Maybe they read 1984 or Brave New World, or even by this point, Hunger Games. And now they know, hey, whatever else I know, whatever other compromises I have to make in this job, I know that those things are bad. And I know that we need to fight against these things. And maybe they're not successful. Maybe they're not doing it for the right reason. But it is a healthy thing and a good thing. And that is another reason why we need dystopian. It's not just for the people. It's also for the people who grow up to join governments and are faced with these temptations.
I just remembered a really good example of how dystopian has played a positive role in society. It was the 1998 movie The Siege, starring Denzel Washington. So it's about a terrorist attack that happens in New York City, which leads to further terrorist attacks, which leads to martial law, which leads to all kinds of crazy things. And I remember watching this in college with my roommates, and then within just a year or two of when we watched it, the 9/11 attacks happened, which we also, watched on television. And we started thinking, oh my goodness, we are going to live in this movie. What happens in this movie, first of all, is that Denzel Washington's character, these hostage negotiators, they are faced with a type of terrorist they haven't really faced before, which doesn't want to just take people hostage, with the bomb vest to get some demands. He just wants to blow people up. His goal is just to kill people. It's not to get anything, and it's to die while he kills people. Well, so first of all, this was very much an eye-opener for a lot of Americans. We were not really equipped for the 9/11 attacks, that people wanted to hijack a plane, not to go somewhere, but to crash it. So already that movie sort of prepared us a little bit for that, living in the post 9/11 world. It did a really important thing, and I'm going a little bit from memory here because I read about this a long time ago. What happens in that movie after these terrorist attacks is that the U.S. military takes over Manhattan Island, and there's soldiers everywhere. They start arresting people who they suspect are involved in this terrorist cell, and they actually find some of the people in the terrorist cell. And then, of course, what do? They torture them for information. And then there's a big public backlash, and it's a very complicated story. It's good guys versus good guys, basically. Like, how do we protect people, and how do we not live in a dystopian world? And then another good guy says, "Well, we're already living in a dystopian world. We got to fight our way out of it." Right? So it's a very complex story in that way. But what that movie did, apparently, was also provide a corrective to people in our government when it came to how do we deal with our population when we suspect there are terrorists there? How do we root out actual evil people without sweeping up the good people? That movie had actually an actual effect on government policy. And it convinced a lot of government leaders it would be really bad to declare martial law. And so that can be a really good use of dystopia, where you see a plausible scenario for how people could react and overreact. More recently, people have referenced the movie V for Vendetta, which is about this dystopian government that rises in the wake of a global pandemic. Where have we seen this before? And so that also, I think, convinced a lot of people not to go too far in keeping people safe. You put people in a prison. These are really good uses for dystopian, and it's why more people should read them, because again, we're in a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We all have a part to play in the government that rules over us. We don't just live under a monarchy where it's a subset of people that get to decide everything. We are the ones that decide things. And so we have to take that responsibility. And as I mentioned earlier, it's honestly kind of sad to me that 8% fewer evangelicals voted this year, according to the reporting I read. That's really unfortunate, because we can't just opt out of the world that we live in. We can't just set aside our responsibility to try to make things better, and obviously in a Christian way. Now, I'm not saying who those 8% of people should have voted for or whatever, but just the fact that you have so many people checked out because, we're all so tired of the political text, right? We want it to go away, but it doesn't work that way.
I am actually okay with some people not voting. Gasped the audience. Yeah, cool your jets. I'm going to explain it real quick, even though we need to wrap up here pretty soon. But if people are that checked out, then I don't know if I want them voting based on that level of ignorance. And that's kind of the more cynical take. But the more compassionate take is that some people are not called to engage this sort of thing. Or maybe some people did, and now they're feeling very battle weary and wounded, and they need to take a step back and just go recover in the military hospital a little bit. Try some finger painting. Maybe read some dystopian novels to help with some of that exposure therapy. I actually recommend this for people, and have recommended it to people who feel so burdened by the process this year that they're just sick of the whole thing. And I think, okay, hey, I think that's okay. Step back, let the rest of us handle it, and then maybe you come next year. Maybe you get some help in between. Or maybe that's just not for you. And I think that is perfectly fine. Not everyone is called to the same job. Certain Christians are called, every Christian I think is called to seek the good of their homeland, to be a good citizen. But how you work that out, that's up to you. And maybe some dystopian fiction can help you in the meantime. By the way, dystopian fiction parents can also help your kids. So if you have teenagers, we have an article at Lorehaven that I would urge you to seek out by Tisha Messing called How to Help Your Teens Engage Dystopian Tales. Really great article overviewing some of the general market stories that we've talked about and offering some discussion questions, but also recommending a heck of a lot of excellent Christian-made dystopian novels, many of which we list or review at lorehaven.com. And our next sponsor also has some dystopian and bad government elements, because it is author Vince Mancuso with the Jabin Kainos trilogy. What if the heroes of old walked among us today? In the story of Jabin Kainos, one young man discovers he has extraordinary abilities locked away in his DNA, and he isn't alone. Set in an America rebuilding from its second civil war, there it is, the Jabin Kainos trilogy blends superhero action with dark conspiracies. As Jabin and his team grow in their abilities, they also learn that the legends of yesterday had monsters to match their heroes. With each book, the stakes grow higher, loyalty is tested, sacrifices are made, and Jabin must discover which defines a hero more, their past or their future. Experience the Jabin Kanos trilogy, where tomorrow's technology meets yesterday's legends. It's perfect for the whole family and is available now on Amazon. Get you that link. See the cool covers in our show notes for this episode 238 at lorehaven.com/podcast. Zach, we have talked about those bad governments out there. We've talked about all the systems out there. But as you've already touched on, that's the topic of chapter 3, the fact that a good dystopian novel also forces us to face the darkness within ourselves.
Yes, because in every dystopian story, there are characters who are fighting for freedom, fighting against the bad guys, getting the pulse rifles or crashing the helicopters or doing all kinds of dystopian fighting things. And there's sort of a, those are exciting and fun, but there's a hidden danger here, which is wish fulfillment. It's wishing I could just go do whatever I want, rappelling off buildings as I swing into the helicopter.
Or punch a Nazi. All the enemies are Nazis,
there you
so
go.
It's okay to punch them. Yeah.
I'm thinking of Agent Smith here, and blowing up everything. Yeah, and so we can sort of get the wrong lesson sometimes. That it's all about just unleashing all the violence that I've dreamed about. That's how we're going to fight things. Well, let's hope not, because the best stories that I've read, or that I'm currently reading one right now, is it's not just about how do you smash a bad system, because honestly, that's not hard. It's really not hard to destroy things. It is hard to build things. It's hard to build a better system, a good system. And that's what's at the center of the Red Rising series that I'm reading by Pierce Brown. Now, for those of you in the Lorehaven Guild, our Discord server, I brought up this series maybe a year ago. I wanted to know, hey, has anyone read this? Because I've heard a lot of friends recommend it. I have some questions about it. What do you think about it? And a lot of people convinced me I should go read it. Man, I am blowing through that series. I'm in book 3 already after just about a month. And that series is not just about confronting this genetically determined aristocracy caste system in the solar system. It's really hard to encapsulate in one sentence. It's about, what do you do once you remove the bad governor or the bad sovereign or the bad system that classifies everyone? How do you put something better in place, especially knowing the lessons of history, because it's very much drilled into them how they got to where they are. So they can't just simply remove bad thing and go back to what they had before, because that was also bad. How do you build something new that you haven't had before? Those are my favorite parts of the story, where they are debating this. And again, it's good guy versus good guy. That's, really true to life. What these stories do is they show us what to avoid in terms of how society could go off the rails. But they do it by pointing you to the mirror and saying, here's what you need to be aware of in yourself. Because when you really look into your own soul and say, how far would you go to fight for freedom, or to fight for your rights, or to fight for justice, you can quickly see how you could go to a pretty dark place to do that, especially when it comes to things that everyone agrees certain people should be brought to justice, certain departments should be reformed or abolished or whatever. There really are bad things that are happening. Okay, well, how far are you going to take this? Are you going to become the monster that you're fighting against is the basic question that Dystopian asks. There's a music video that's just a really good visual depiction of this. It's called Will of the People by Tim Pool. And it shows this cycle of violence of like one revolution leading to the next, leading to the next, leading to the next. And it's like a different team and a different political tribe each time doing basically the same things, even though they have totally different values, they have totally different, laws and policies, but it's like that underlying impulse to punish people. As you mentioned earlier, Stephen, Romans 13 says that the government is put in place by God to praise what is good and to punish what is evil. And too often, the rule in politics is reward your friends and punish your enemies. And man, if that is applied, if everyone just starts applying that, boy, we're in for a rough time, right? And I would say we are living already in that time. And there's been some recent stories where if you were the wrong political persuasion, you were basically punished or denied help, and that's terrible. But to simply turn that around and just reverse the polarity on that, that's not going to lead to a good place either. And so the Hunger Games did this so well in book 3. It really shows, basically meet the new boss, same as the old boss kind of thing.
What a depressing finale, too. Lots of fans hated it for that reason.
It was. And I liked it because of that, because it's basically a Greek tragedy, right? Or a Shakespearean tragedy. And it sticks with you because you're like, man, I could easily become that person. I could become that just vengeful person. I'm just going to obliterate everything, scorched earth, and then just become that same monster that they were fighting against. And so these stories really get us to look in the mirror.
Zach, that's a fantastic point, of course. And it also goes to the purpose of what we do at Lorehaven, even going beyond this podcast. Often, and I think necessarily, we will have episodes about apologetics, basically story apologetics or cultural apologetics. We will explore trauma and suffering and how stories help us with that. Or we will explore certain lies or false doctrines that can infect stories, certain agendas like the sexual revolution that are poisoning not only our souls, but also our enjoyment of God's gift of imagination. And those are necessary. And frankly, they play very well, especially on social media, because folks like the battle. A particular type of personality, they are given to the battle. It gives them purpose. It certainly gives them drama. And wow, if we had a whole lot of drama on the socio-political scene in the past week and certainly over the past months. And the drama is great, but it will not last. And is certainly only a small segment. Our human drama is only a small segment of the massive plot line that our author is inscribing in his book, The Universe. So I don't want us to focus so much on the drama that we lose sight of that, and that we lose sight of the truth articulated by Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that the line between good and evil goes through every human heart. A good dystopian story, old or new, will portray this subtly or often overtly. And I really don't want us to lose sight of that, even here at this podcast. We try to keep a balance between apologetics for some of the bad ideas, but pointing especially toward the hope that we have in Christ our King. There's so many stories, especially fantasy genres proper, that focus on kings and queens, royalty, those entrusted with stewardship over a people, over a nation. And some of them go a little more epic, talking about battles and the politics and the entanglements and such. And then others are just simple stories about what goes on at the royal ball, and they keep the political stuff in the background, and she has to decide whether she's going to marry the stable boy for love or marry the prince of the neighboring kingdom in order to prevent war between their peoples. It's a cliche for a reason. But even those little plot elements in the background reflect that dystopian impulse, trying to be a good leader, trying to contribute to good government, and then balance that with the humanity that God has given us. So even on this show, going into next year, if there's any optimism at all that we have, it is to celebrate the gift of imagination throughout these genres, to be aware of the threat of dystopian, but especially aware of the deeper threat that lies in our human hearts. The villain of sin, the greatest battle lies within, that calls for action, a lifestyle of repentance and believing in our Lord Jesus Christ. And after all, some people say it the troll, but it is true. Christ is Lord, Christ is King, Christ is Savior, and in him there is no dystopian darkness at all.
Yeah, and as much as dystopian stories get us to focus on who is on the, throne of a country or whatever, we definitely have to focus more on who's on the throne of our lives, whether it's self or whether it's Christ, and what is being followed and given our obedience to. I'm going to end with this quote from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and it very much goes with the Jack Bauer quote from earlier. Lewis says, quote, "Good and evil both increase at compound interest. That is why the little decisions you and I make every day are of such infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point, from which a few months later you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. An apparently trivial indulgence in lust or anger today is the loss of a ridge or railway line or bridgehead from which the enemy may launch an attack otherwise impossible, unquote. And I love that picture of these small choices being battles in a war that we're fighting. We're not just fighting a war against, bad human leaders. We're fighting a spiritual war against the rulers and authorities of this present darkness, spiritual evil beings. Every point in our daily lives is a decision. Am I going to capture territory from which I can do greater things? Or am I going to lose territory from which I'm going to be attacked further? And, we're up against an enemy that doesn't play fair, doesn't play nice, and he's warring for our soul. And that's the most important battle to win. And that's the most important freedom to attain.
How have dystopian stories helped you fight for a better world? That is our discussion question for this episode. Let us know about your favorites and how they have helped you change your life, be aware of your darkness, and maybe even vote better or look forward to better kings or queens in our nations. Email us, podcast@lorehaven.com, or find us on the socials. Share this episode on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Get your social media fix, F-I-X. Just look for Lorehaven on any of those platforms. Share this episode. And even though we don't have a book to give away this time, we'd love for you to share that episode. But we do now have to announce the winner of that book from 2 episodes ago that we promised if you shared that episode with Mike Duran about Christian horror. Mike generously donated a physical edition of that nonfiction resource. I think he's going to sign it and everything and mail it to you. And we said, if you share this episode, help us get the word out, then we will enter your name in the drawing. There we go. I have that wheel in front of me now. I am going to spin the wheel now. We had, yep, there they are. Well, there's one blank space. So if we hit that blank space, we'll spin again. But let me just spin that and see who our winner is going to be right now, at which point we'll have Mike reach out to you about that. Okay, there we go. Hopefully I don't land on bankruptcy. We have a winner. It is Brian Timothy Mitchell, author. He's actually been a podcast sponsor of this show before, but we do not discriminate there. Brian Timothy Mitchell, congratulations. We will get you a copy of Christian Horror by Mike Duran. I think we know how to find you, so stand by for that email if you haven't already received it by the time this episode releases. Next on Fantastical Truth, I'm going to run the show solo this time, going toward the Thanksgiving season. We love stories here with fine writing. As the scripture says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. But often readers don't necessarily need a purple prose phrase. They want some basic style. They want a quick tool of phrase with the simple job of getting you in and out of a fantastical work of fiction, no frills. Which kind of stories do you, as a reader, prefer, and why? Well, it's been quite a week if you've paid attention to the news, and even if you haven't been, the news is paying attention to you. But let's use any of that stuff as a means for other ends. Let's not get stuck in the battles. Let's not fear for our lives from the real-life dystopian tyrants that we've either made up or that actually exist out there. Either way, Christ is on his throne. In him, there is no dystopian darkness at all. And we can train, whether you call it exposure therapy or otherwise, to confront the dystopian realities that we risk just living in a fallen world, looking forward to Christ's return as we continue to seek and find his fantastical truth.